thanks everyone for coming.
Hello. Okay, we come.
Yeah, we've got a full house tonight, which is really good to see. Tonight we're going to be talking about imperialism in Ukraine and also Venezuela. And we've got Alan McKinnon, who is on the Scottish committee of the Communist Party, and he's also on the Scottish executive of CND, but speaking in a personal capacity, speaking as a communist tonight. And then we've got Paul Dobson, who's been over in Venezuela, has been involved in some of the struggles there, the right-wing kind of attempted coup that's going on, so he's going to give us a bit of detail on that. So after two speakers make their contributions, we'll have time for the question and answers at the end. So, but we'll start off with Alan. Right.
Okay, thanks very much. I think it's good that we've got both these contributions coming from different parts of the world because they do show the way in which American imperialism is attempting to intervene in the democratic processes in countries well outside its own area, and I think it shows the dangers that are present in imperialism today as we speak. On the 15th of September last year, soldiers from 15 countries started an 11-day battalion-sized military exercise near the city of Lviv in Ukraine. Nothing very special about that to people who know about these things, because the Americans and NATO carry out hundreds of joint military exercises with other countries, with the armed forces of other countries every year. But what was special about this event was that this took place in the west of Ukraine while a civil war was raging in the east of Ukraine. And it also took place just 7 months after the violent overthrow of the democratically elected government in that country. Intended to provide clearly a ringing endorsement from NATO that it supports the new government in Ukraine, a government which we have to say was composed of right-wing nationalist and some fascist elements. So that's the kind of situation that we're involved in. I think the argument that I'm going to be putting here is that this is not just about the people of Ukraine expressing democratic choice. Certainly there was a mass movement in Ukraine on the streets of particularly western Ukraine in January and February of 2014. But it's also the outcome of years of massive intervention in the politics and the economy of that country by the United States, by NATO and by Germany in particular. And in identifying this, I think it's important to look at the role of shadowy figures like Victoria Nuland. She's the Assistant Secretary of State for Europe and Eurasia. She is a former special advisor, a kind of foreign policy advisor to Dick Cheney. To give you something about her own personal background, she's married to a guy called Robert Kagan, who is a co-founder of the Project for the New American Century. She's part of a cabal of neoconservatives who got established in both the State Department and the Pentagon during the second Bush administration, and who have consolidated their position even during the Obama period. And indeed so much so that there is it's generally recognised that Obama has had to, in order to bypass these people in the State Department and in the Pentagon, he's had to establish his own inner circle of advisors to give him advice on foreign policy over the past few years. So it gives you some idea of the extent to which these people are entrenched within the bureaucracy of the United States and are taking decisions almost on their own in terms of the foreign policy and intervention. Victoria Nuland also boasted during a dinner kind of for business interests in Ukraine about 2 years ago, that the United States has spent $5 billion in an attempt to influence the democratic process in Ukraine over the past 2 decades. $5 billion. If it was 5 million, it would be surprising. 5 billion is an astonishing figure. And you can just imagine how that kind of intervention, that kind of money, could massively distort the democratic process in any country in the world, but particularly in a poor country like Ukraine. She was involved in detailed negotiations about the nature of the coup and who would take power after the coup, because prior to the coup there are taped telephone conversations that she was involved in which she used expletives about the role, the inadequate role of the EU as she described it, but she also named the guy who she wanted to be Prime Minister. And of course, after the coup, who was Prime Minister? Andrei Yatsenyuk, the very person that she had named, and he stole the Prime Minister of Ukraine today. So gives you an idea of the intimate way in which the United States was involved in the overthrow of the Yanukovych government, and indeed the level of intervention in that country over a number of years. Ukraine, of course, is a multinational, a multi-ethnic state. It's historically been part of a number of empires, including the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Ottoman Empire, the Russian Empire, it's got many people who are ethnically Hungarians, Romanians, Poles, Russians. It's got quite a large Slav population, and it's got quite a large Jewish population. So you've got a real mixed bag. It's very similar to many of the other countries in Central and Eastern Europe who have changed hands as a result of the wars that have raged across that continent over the past few centuries. The economy of Ukraine was rapidly privatised in the early 1990s, very similar to the process that took place in Russia itself, and the outcome of that was that much of the economy and the productive resources are now owned by a tiny group of very wealthy oligarchs. And the politics of Ukraine since that time, over the past 20 years or so, there's been a succession of presidents, each of whom have represented one or other clan of oligarchs over that period. So, and it's important to point out that Yanukovych, which was the government which was overthrown in February of last year, was no exception to that rule. He also represented oligarchs, oligarch interests. He was also corrupt. And as all previous presidents have been corrupt, his family enriched themselves, and he enriched himself as a result of occupying his position. And he was erratic in terms of his policy. He was elected on the policy of non-alignment, but he then attempted to establish closer relationships with the EU, and finally he rejected the offer they made, which would have involved quite harsh austerity being imposed on the Ukrainian economy, and he then accepted an offer from Russia for a $15 billion loan, the promise of discounted gas supplies, and becoming a member of a new customs union involving Belarus, Russia, and Kazakhstan, as well as Ukraine. Of course, that's what sparked the rebellion from within the country. But that's to give you some kind of background. The economy of Ukraine is highly indebted, and as a result of shock therapy imposed by the EU and the IMF, its economy has nosedived, living standards have nosedived, and millions of people have been driven deeper into poverty in that country, where there's already, living standards had already, over the past 2 decades, had already collapsed to less than half what they were in the old days of the Soviet Union. Its politics is complex and rapidly changing. I'll just name some of the political parties that are involved. The Fatherland Party, which is the party of Tymoshenko, who significantly held power at one time and was in prison for several years because of corruption. That party got 25% of the vote in the 2012 elections. It's largely regarded as being US funded. Another party, which is a new party, which was partly formed from the Fatherland Party, is the People's Front, which in the most recent elections, it didn't exist 2 years ago, but in the most recent elections, it secured 22% of the vote. And was more or less level with the party that's been built around the new president, Poroshenko. It's called the Poroshenko Bloc, and it's perhaps more centrist, but it also has only existed since 2014. Another party is the Democratic Alliance, which is perhaps a smaller group. It's the one which is the party of the boxer Klitschko. It won 13% of the vote in 2012. It's regarded as being German funded, German supported. Then you've got Svoboda, which is an openly fascist party, really. It's extreme right, it's anti-Semitic, it's xenophobic, and that's the EU which has used these terms about it. It secured 9% of the vote in the 2012 elections, and it played a big part in the street mobilisations that took place prior to the overthrow of the government. You've also got three smaller extremely right-wing and neo-Nazi organisations. One's called Spilna Prava, Common Cause, one's called Trezub or Trident, another one is called the Right Sector. All of these were heavily involved in the street mobilisations and the final assault on government buildings that took place in February 2014. Svoboda went on to secure several ministerial posts in the new government immediately after the overthrow of Yanukovych, and the Right Sector got one post. Quite quickly, the Communist Party became the focus of attack from both nationalist and fascist forces. Its premises were burnt down, communist individuals were attacked and assaulted, communist MPs, there were 23 communist MPs in the previous administration, they were forcibly excluded from the parliament, and the party itself was outlawed, a basic, fundamental denial of democracy. In February of last year, the rump of the Rada voted to, the Rada is the parliament, voted to end the legal status of minority languages such as Russian, Hungarian, Polish and Romanian, giving a message to people who were not purely ethnically Ukrainian, that there's no place for you in this new Ukraine. Hardly surprising that a rebellion started in the east of the country. There's also been the formation of territorial defence battalions, the so-called volunteer battalions, which are largely staffed by people from the extreme right, many of them neo-Nazis. The kind of Azov battalion, which many people will have heard of, which is spearheading a lot of the attacks on the rebels in the Donbass area. That uses neo-Nazi insignia. Their links with the far right are well known. Although these battalions, I think there's about 50 of them, different battalions with at least 7,000 volunteers. Although these battalions are supposed to be under the control of the Ukrainian army, effectively they seem to be largely autonomous, and they seem to be also quite a lot of them are privately funded as well. So you can see that there's a process here. There's almost like a kind of secret fascist force which is in existence and is used to carry out policy. The most recent elections showed a fall in support for these far-right parties. Svoboda only secured a few seats in the new parliament, and the Right Sector only got one. Most of the seats were won by the two new parties, by the People's Front and by the Poroshenko bloc. But I think it would be a mistake to think that this somehow represents a move back to the centre, a move away from the right in terms of the politics of Ukraine. What's really happened is that these two parties have actually moved to the right, and many of them secured the election on their programme of far-right individuals. So there are still plenty of fascists inside the Ukrainian parliament, even though there's been a decline in the electoral support for some of the openly fascist organisations. And indeed the People's Front, which is led by the Prime Minister Yatsenyuk, includes many people who have previously been commanders of these battalions. So you can see that this connection between the militarised right and one of the government parties. They've also have a policy which is that their way of resolving the problem in the eastern part of the Ukraine is military victory. And that's quite different from the position of Poroshenko, the president, who argues for negotiations and a peace agreement. So you can see that there are different voices saying different things, but the voice of the extreme right is still very strong in that part of the world. I think Ukraine is an important case study because it's one of the areas in which NATO is expanding into the space left by the collapse of the Soviet Union, into the space left by the kind of the breakup of Yugoslavia, and into the space left by the Warsaw Pact when it dissolved itself. All of that in breach of promises that were made at the time by the United States, that they would not do that in return for Soviet support for the unification of Germany. They promised that NATO would not move eastwards. Well, they've broken every part of that promise, because NATO, instead of being dissolved at the end of the Cold War, has been expanded from 16 members to 28 members today, and there are plans for further expansion. There are at least 4 countries which are earmarked for inclusion for full membership of NATO in the next few years. One is Georgia, which already has fought a war with Russia and is right on the borders of Russia. The other 3 are former Yugoslav states: Bosnia-Herzegovina, Montenegro, and I've forgotten the last one. Macedonia. Okay, so NATO expansion has taken place despite the fact that there is no threat anymore. And yet the reason for the formation of NATO and for the building up of NATO was ostensibly to counter a threat from a military threat from the Soviet Union. With the collapse of the Soviet Union, with the disbandment of the Warsaw Pact, the military rationale for that disappeared. But NATO didn't disappear. In fact, it's been expanded, which gives a lie to the whole kind of rationale for the creation of NATO. It's an aggressive military alliance. It's kind of dependent on the use of nuclear weapons, and in the first use of nuclear weapons, it's always been. The reality is that the real reason is not to counter any external threat, because there is no external threat. They're trying to manufacture external threats from Iran, from terrorism, from cyber attack, even from the kind of the danger of the European states falling out among each other, which is one of the arguments that's used in the United States. One of the US provides the glue which holds Europe together and keeps Germany down, kind of thing, you know. Well, nobody really believes that anymore. If that's a reason for the United States to invest vast amounts of money in this military project. The reality is, of course, it's a vehicle for the projection of US power. It's a way of binding other countries into support for America's foreign policy, and as a result of that, able to then use that to use the military in support of every other country, to gear it all towards American foreign policy, and as a result of that, not only to control the politics and the foreign policy of Europe, but to use that as a base for projecting power into North Africa, into the Middle East, into the Caucasus, into Central Asia and elsewhere. So it's about being able to provide a cover for US policy in large parts of the world. Remember that NATO is the biggest military alliance in the world, and therefore it's vitally important. It's being used much more aggressively with the current administration than it was even with Bush. Bush had a tendency to want to do things on his own. He tended to want to project US power unilaterally, get into a lot of bother as a result of that. Obama has recognised that America is no longer the dominant power it once was, and recognised that he needs to work with allies, and therefore NATO is the biggest and most important military alliance in the world. In the Far East, as part of the pivot to Asia, it's been about bilateral arrangements with other countries, including Japan, South Korea, Australia, and to a lesser extent India and other countries. Again, militarising these countries, just as it's militarising the countries that are involved with it in Europe. So it's a militarisation process which is quite inappropriate given the situation that there is no military threat to the West at the present time. So it's a vehicle for the expansion of US power, and it's a way of being able to impact, kind of impose a Pax Americana on North Africa, the Middle East, etc. What are the vehicles that NATO uses to expand? The key to this is the NATO partnership organisations, and the most important one perhaps is the Partnership for Peace, which has 22 members, and is a way of preparing countries for membership of the European, the North Atlantic Treaty Organisation. So the first organisation is a Partnership for Peace. 4 of these countries that I've already mentioned are already being prepared for full membership and will assume full membership over the next few years. Another organisation is the Mediterranean Dialogue, which is a way of drawing in the countries on the north of Africa and the Levant. So the countries that are involved in that are Mauritania, Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, Egypt, Jordan and Israel. So again, you can see the way, hardly any of these countries have got any semblance of democracy. So the idea that somehow NATO spreads democracy, but these are the countries which NATO is drawing into their web. Another partnership organisation is the Istanbul Cooperation Initiative, which draws in the countries around the Persian Gulf. So you've got Kuwait, you've got Bahrain, you've got the United Arab Emirates, you've got Qatar, and a couple of observer states are in Saudi Arabia and Oman. So again, not a shred of democracy there, but at the same time, they're countries that are being drawn in to the NATO web. And then you've got NATO's global partners, which include Japan, South Korea, Australia, New Zealand, Mongolia, Pakistan, Colombia. Again, not too much democracy there, but it's about establishing a global network of countries who are not members of NATO, but at the same time they are associates of NATO. They have an enhanced relationship with NATO, and the danger is that they, at some stage in the future, could become full members of NATO, and that NATO could take on a totally global role, which would then displace the United Nations, because of the big problem for the United States is that it no longer controls the UN, whereas it can control NATO. So that's a major danger, that NATO, which is already operating well out of area, could become a truly global force at some stage in the future. And that's something that we're obviously going to have to develop the campaign against. So it gives you some idea of the way in which NATO is growing, expanding, and the vehicles which it's using to draw in countries which are not formally members of NATO at the moment, but which could become members in the future. If NATO is the military project, then the EU is the economic part of that project. And it's very interesting how the growth of NATO and the EU go hand in hand. Both organisations have got 28 members. 22 countries are members of both. And in some cases it's the EU that comes first, in some cases it's NATO that comes first, but it prepares the way for the other. And the interesting thing is, although most people accept that the United States is the dominant nation within NATO because of its huge military power. What people very often don't realise is that the United States has growing influence inside the EU as well. You've got two wings inside the EU, as inside NATO. You've got the Anglo-American axis, and you've got the Franco-German one. The French and Germans initially set up the EU, but increasingly it's the United States which is calling the tune, partly because Britain plays the role as the Trojan horse. The City of London is the key entry point for American capital, mainly banking capital. The Americans have got something like $2.6 trillion invested in Europe at the present time. Vast amount of money. But also they have huge influence through Britain, because Britain basically does America's bidding in the EU, and also through its influence with the newer East European members of NATO as well. So it is a joint body, but at the same time the influence of the United States, not just in the economy of the EU but also in the politics of the EU, is a growing danger, and as a way in which the economic and the military push take place at the same time, simultaneously. So I think I've probably said enough to give you an idea of what's going on. I think the key thing just now is that it's important to remember that while the United States is making quite big advances across the world, its star is falling. It is an imperial nation which is in decline. It's just lost two major wars in the Middle East, in Iraq and Afghanistan. You could argue that the same thing happened in Syria and also in Libya. And perhaps maybe starting to happen now in Yemen. It has lost its base of support in Latin America, which I'm sure we're going to hear about later on tonight. Economically, its star is falling. It's being overhauled, rapidly overhauled by the economies of the Far East, especially China. But it has retained one thing which no other country has. It remains a military superpower. It has 11 carrier groups which patrol every ocean in the world. It has 1,000 military bases, more than 1,000 military bases scattered across every continent. It accounts for 40% of global arms spending. You know, when you compare the arms spending of the United States and China, which is often kind of compared, you know, China spends 1/7 of the amount that the United States spends on weapons of war. So you're talking about a global military superpower, and the great danger is that in this situation, where it's an economy in decline, where it's being overhauled, where its role is being usurped by other areas, that it will attempt to use the one advantage it has over all other countries, its huge military machine, to get its way, to demand its way, to prise open the economies of every country to the predations of American multinational firms. That's the grave danger, that it will use this single major advantage that it has at the present time. So it remains a military superpower. It's important to note then that the expansion of NATO and the coup in the Ukraine have provoked a reaction from Russia within Ukraine itself, but also supported by Russia, and that in turn is now being used to ratchet up the East-West confrontation. There's a new, very rapid spearhead force of 5,000 troops ready to deploy within 48 hours, which is now being developed, and it's now operational, and that's backed up by a further a rapid intervention force of 25,000 troops, which will be ready to deploy within a month. Also, new NATO bases and command centres in 6 East European countries, again ringing the Soviet, well, what used to be the Soviet Union, ringing Russia with military bases, as well, in the same way that it's ringing also Iran and China as well, although that's not really the subject of tonight's discussion. So we're facing a very dangerous situation. We're getting a reaction from NATO, which is actually bringing the threat of war far closer. We're returning to the Cold War that we've only just left just over 20 years ago. And this issue is also being used to justify things like the squandering of £100 billion on a new system of weapons of mass destruction. Trident is being justified as a result. We need to keep Trident because of the Russian threat. And there's also people arguing that Britain needs to increase its conventional defence spending as well, even though in budgetary terms that may not happen. But it's certainly being used as an argument that we need to continue to punch our weight across the world. So these are all grave dangers that I think will be used to damage our movement, to damage the peace movement. And what we're facing is a huge mass media barrage where no other voices are heard, which blames Russia for the current situation in Ukraine, which vilifies Vladimir Putin. Alternative views are simply not being heard. So our job, I think, is to present that alternative view, to build the role of the peace movement. That this is a political issue. We need to challenge the role of Trident, which is assigned to NATO. We need to challenge US kind of British support for UK policy, for US policy, and the special relationship, the umbilical cord that ties us to every foreign intervention, except for the last one, the last attempt at getting military kind of intervention against Syria was defeated as a result of a vote in the House of Commons, and that was defeated as a result of the campaign, the 10-year long campaign of campaigning against the war by the anti-war movement and by the peace movement, you know, on both sides of the Atlantic. So there's a weariness for war among people, you know, and that was a huge victory, I think, for the peace movement, where we stopped. The first war was stopped in recent decades, which should give us hope for the future, but we shouldn't be complacent about that. So there's a huge amount to be done. We need to do more to break that special relationship that binds us to American foreign policy. We need to break with NATO, which is the way in which that is made effective in European terms. So there's a huge amount for us to do, it seems to me, and we need to build the movement, build the solidarity with the people of Ukraine, and try and prevent this war from escalating in a way that could threaten the peace of the entire world. That's the challenge before us, I think. So I hope we're up to it.
Thanks very much, Alan. That was really interesting. I'm sure there'll be lots of questions, which we'll come to in a bit. But first, I'd like to hand over to Paul Dobson, who is a comrade who has been in Venezuela for the last few years, and he's going to tell us about the struggle going on over there. So, hand over to you, Paul.
So, moving from the icy slopes of Ukraine to the steamy plains of Venezuela. But it's the same story. Very similar story. For those of you who don't know me, my name's Paul. I've been in Venezuela for nearly 10 years, working, amongst other things, as a journalist. I'm a member of the Communist Party of Venezuela. I'm on the regional committee for the state where I live. My responsibility is communication and propaganda. Thanks for all coming. It's great to see, with all due respect to the slightly elderly members of the Communist Party, it's great to see so many young people here. Not looking at
Thanks very much, that's a big
great. It makes me think back to some of the first contact I had with socialist thoughts and ideas in Edinburgh, and often it's very abstract. No, often it's very, you know, in the nice warm heated rooms here in Glasgow and other parts. It's very abstract to talk about socialism here. In Venezuela, it's not. In Venezuela, we're very much living the process of dismantling a capitalist bourgeois state and trying, like toddlers sometimes, to construct a working class state, a people state, a socialist state. I say like toddlers because we don't really know what we're doing, to be honest with you. We make errors, Sometimes we fall over, we have to pick ourselves up and carry on, correcting the mistakes we make. But we must be doing something right. Because a few weeks ago, the Pentagon declared us a threat to their national security. Don't know why people are laughing. I agree with them. maybe they're talking about a military threat. Okay, military threat is laughable. Although Venezuela actually has the most advanced anti-air force weapons in the world. But putting the military questions aside, which I don't come to talk about, they are posing a threat. They're posing an alternative, an example, in the same way that Cuba was a threat to the Pentagon, a threat to the White House. Obviously, Venezuela is a long way off getting as far as Cuba has. But the fact that they've declared us a threat means that we must be doing something right, in my opinion. In Venezuela, at the moment, the contradictions are deepening very quickly. The numerous contradictions have existed from the previous social structure before who retired in 1998. There are numerous contradictions which have arisen since 1998. But the contradiction I'm here to talk about today is one of the major contradictions which has existed long before 1998, but now is more evident than it ever has been. And this is a contradiction between nation and imperialism, which we live in and feel in Venezuela nearly every day. I probably won't have to spend much time talking about the national interests of Venezuela, the world's largest oil exporter. I think, if I'm not mistaken, the third largest resources of natural gas, raw materials, precious stones, amongst other things. And the interests of imperialism, which are pretty much the same, to be honest with you. A couple of weeks ago, the White House, by presidential order, note, not by discussion in the houses or the democratic bodies of the United States, but rather by presidential decree, declared Venezuela to be a threat to national security. This comes, I'll let you draw your own conclusions, just a few weeks after the much made of warming of relations with Cuba. No? Now Venezuela is a national threat. Cuba not so much, apparently. Apparently. What was the response of the Venezuelan government? Very efficient. Within a few days, Venezuela set up its own counter-sanctions on the United States, which include American citizens now need visas to get into Venezuela. Venezuelan officials need a special visa to get into Venezuela. Most of them have been declared persona non grata. The American embassy, which still exists in Caracas, was massively scaled down. If I'm not mistaken, in the Venezuelan consulate in New York, there were 17 members of staff. In the American consulate in Caracas, there were something like 200. This has now been brought down to exactly the same level. If Venezuela allows 17 people in the US allows 17 people in Venezuela. Equal footing. The president started a very important campaign to inform the population and help the country understand what was happening. So this wasn't just anti-Americanism. This was an action against the US government, not the US people. Okay? Why? In the words of Nicolas Maduro, the president, he said, there's a very strong link between the cases in the last couple of years where the US have declared a country of a threat to national security, and then in a few years military action against this country. Libya, Iraq, Ukraine, other examples. Well, then now they've just declared Venezuela a threat to national security, so what's that mean? In the next couple of years, what's going to happen? You don't have to be a genius to work it out, do you? No? As part of this national educational campaign, we're seeing massive shows of solidarity all across the country. Everything from trade union organisations, women's groups, racial minority groups, international bodies. The Bolivarian Alliance, ALBA, almost immediately issued a declaration. The Community of Latin American and Caribbean Nations, CELAC, the UNASUR, There's only one left to go, which is a right-wing Latin American body called the ONU. We've seen nearly, I think there's now over 1.5 million signatures calling on President Obama to correct his mistake. Campaigns are being set up in other neighbouring countries in South America, pushing for Obama to reassess his presidential decree. What was the reaction of the Venezuelan bourgeoisie? Nothing, really. They neither criticised this move by Obama, nor do they applaud it. If they applauded it, they wouldn't have found many supporters, no? They were left in a very difficult political space between a rock and a hard stone. They just kept quiet. No response from the Venezuelan bourgeoisie whatsoever. The people, the communal councils, the women's groups, the health committees, are organising themselves. Like I say, getting signatures down, campaigns on the social networking groups, international campaigns. And I think maybe one of the most important moves was a move by Maduro, which was very, I think it sent waves, which probably reached the Pentagon, I hope they did, whereby he appealed for an enabling act from the National Assembly. The National Assembly in Venezuela is currently dominated by revolutionary MPs. And what do I mean by an enabling act? An enabling act gives him a limited, both in terms of scope and time, powers to rule by decree in Venezuela. This is called the Anti-Imperialist Enabling Act, which was signed into law about 2 weeks ago, shortly before I travelled. This gives President Maduro until the 31st of December to sign laws into law by presidential decree when they are concerning national security, both territorial and social. Could you imagine David Cameron doing this? Be an outcry, wouldn't there? This means that the day after President Maduro was granted these powers, like I say, limited powers until a very certain date and with a very certain scope. It doesn't give him powers to pass laws about health or education or taxes, no. The following day, he called on a national mobilization of the armed forces. No? This wasn't to scare the US, because, as Alan pointed out, there's no way you can compete with the US military might. But it was about showing that, as Hugo Chavez always said, the Venezuelan revolution is peaceful, but armed. No? What does that mean? It means it's a peaceful revolution. We're not going to go looking for fights in the White House. No, we're not going to start invading Miami. No. But we're also not going to sit with our arms crossed if they come and, excuse my French, fuck with us. It's an armed revolution. It doesn't mean holding a gun. It means organised people. It means having people out on the streets. Okay? It means having international links and getting word out about what's actually happening. Okay? And so this was the response in Venezuela. Just to give you a little bit of the context of this latest attack, or this escalated attack from the Pentagon, because this is nothing new. I mean, I'm sure most of you know, there's no point going back to 2002, the American-funded coup d'etat against Hugo Chavez, 2004, the oil lockout, and so on and so on and so on. More recently, which maybe you haven't quite, news hasn't got this far, but the US is currently launching an economic war against Venezuela. No? This isn't quite like the economic war they launched in Chile against Allende, but it's similar. No? What do I mean by an economic war? I mean induced inflation, currently running at 67%. Induced meaning they're encouraging businessmen to buy at $1 and sell it tomorrow at $10. Induced inflation. We're talking smuggling. Because of the price disparities, nearly 50% of subsidized Venezuelan goods, which are intended for the poor people in Venezuela, people who have no money, 50% of these goods are sent to Colombia to make massive profit margins. Smuggling. We're talking shortages. nearly every week there's at least one, often 2 or 3 news stories coming out with photos, evidence. It's there for anyone to see. Warehouses full of goods. Goods that have been there for 5, 6, 7 months. Everything from baby milk, nappies, sugar, food products, tyres, car batteries, induced shortages. The products are arriving into Venezuela and people are being paid to put them in a big warehouse and lock them away. It means that when people need to go and buy a car battery, there's no car batteries on the shelves. What does this produce? More induced inflation. This is the economic war. It's a lot more complex now. We don't have time to go into it completely. But there are very clear links that have proven that this is being instigated from outside Venezuela, mostly from Panama, from Miami, okay, using the local bourgeoisie, using the local Venezuelan business classes to do the dirty work, often unconscious of what they're actually doing. And this is a reality. This is a reality. More recently, the Americans were very clearly behind an attempted coup d'etat in February against President Maduro. Venezuela, as many other Latin American nations opposing US hegemony, are quite often on the sharp end of the US stick when it comes to coup d'etat. We're quite used to hearing attempted coup d'etats against the government of Nicolas Maduro and obviously Hugo Chavez. But this one seemed a lot more serious than most. Again, producing video evidence to the public, telephone recordings, photographs. Okay, so we're not talking about rumours here, we're talking about everything with hard evidence. They showed how a group of military Air Force officials, generals, had been promised a very large sum in US dollars, political asylum and visas into the US in return for trying to instigate an uprising in the armed forces against the democratic government of Nicolas Maduro. This included plans for the bombing of the presidential palace. Those of you who lived through Salvador Allende's fall will remember that. The bombing of the presidential palace with a Tucson fighter jet supplied from Colombia, not even a Venezuelan fighter jet, Colombian fighter jet, and numerous political figures who were supposedly going to propose a government of transition and so on and so on and so on. This is a reality. This isn't a soap. This isn't something you read in a history book from the 1920s or something. This happened 2 weeks ago. Okay. Why now? Why now? Again, complicated question. I think the quickest and easiest, most direct answer would be that in a couple of months we've got elections. Again, the 20th election in 16 years in Venezuela, all declared free and fair by numerous international bodies, including the TUC, okay, the Carter Foundation, the EU. 20 popular, free elections in 16 years, with an average turnout of between 80 and 85%. Every single time. Not just once like it was here in Scotland a couple of months ago, no? Every single time. We have parliamentary elections coming up at the end of this year. And they are creating the conditions in the country, the social unrest in the country, to create a majority in the parliament against the national government of Nicolas Maduro. Okay? They're making people hungry. They're making sure housewives don't have milk for their babies. They're making sure there's not enough medication in the pharmacies. Why? Just so they can win a vote. Okay? Why do they want to win that vote? To try and put the brakes on Maduro and eventually get their hands on the oil and make a lot of money. That's it. Very simple. Okay? Who's suffering? The housewives, the sick people, the people with not enough money to go and buy their products on the black market. No? So when we talk about coup d'etats, often they mean one moment of time. 2002 in Venezuela was an example. They kidnapped the president, very clearly a coup d'etat, against Rafael Correa, as well a few years ago. But often coup d'etats can be, in Venezuela this is a very widely used term, a slow coup d'etat would be the translation, by stages, taken over a year or 2 years. Okay, it's not just one sharp moment of unrest, but a long period of overthrow of a democratic government through non-democratic measures. And this is what's happening in Venezuela. Okay, through the economy, through all of the other measures I've talked about. Okay, just to finish up, because I think it'd be more interesting to hear your questions than hear me talk. What can be done? I've travelled quite a long way to get here, and I don't want to leave before saying what can be done. Often it's very well and good just saying, no, this is awful, but something has to be done. No? And the fact that you're a long way away from Caracas in Venezuela doesn't mean you can't do anything. No. Any type of public statements are released from organisations, from universities, from trade unions, from whatever, community groups, declarations against this sort of US inventionism are welcome. Newspaper articles in the Guardian, in the BBC, whatever, Russia Today, they're useful. Solidarity work here, telling people about what's actually going on, or not what they hear in the BBC, not what they hear in the CNN, whatever, what's actually going on, that's useful. Coming out to Venezuela, coming out on the Solidarity delegation, seeing through your own eyes, don't believe in what I have to say about it, come and see for yourself, that's useful. Okay. And finally, there has been calls for an International Day of Solidarity, so you can put in your diaries, for the 19th of April. Okay. It's a call made from the Venezuelan Communist Party, which is the Venezuelan left-wing party with the best international relations in terms of sister parties, and they have called for an International Day of Solidarity on the 19th of April. So there's a lot that can be done. That's everything I had to say. Thank you.
Thanks again, Paul, for another excellent contribution. I'm going to open it up to the floor now for contributions.